Hello, and welcome to my channel. This is going to be my first time doing a video like this. If I get more of these, I might do more reactions in the future, or in this case, a response video. But I was browsing YouTube, and just for the fun of it, I was curious if anybody out there had read my book. I reached out long ago to several YouTubers to review my book, The Guardian of Light, and I got some responses, but for the most part, I hardly got any responses back. A few people said yes, maybe. I sent them copies in PDF files, and most said no. They didn't have the time or they weren't interested in fantasy. Like I said, I was just randomly browsing YouTube just to see, and by mere chance, I actually came across, I guess, my very first YouTube book review. And so I watched it, of course, and before I jump into the video, I just want to thank these two gentlemen who reviewed my book at Adventuresome Reviews for taking the time to read my book. And despite whatever I say in this video, I'm really happy with the review they gave it. I was expecting it to be worse. I mean, most authors are usually pretty low on themselves anyhow. So, I mean, for the review I got, I was actually quite happy. So, let's jump right into this review with Adventuresome Reviews.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and various other undesirables. We are Adventuresome Reviews, and today we are reviewing The Guardian of Light by Sean Connaughton, or some variation thereof.
You're very close on my name. It really doesn't matter, but just for the record, it's Connaughton.
Which we had to play the author most horribly to get this book. It was horrible. Now, this is a book that was submitted to us to review. And yeah, I know that, but it's a much better story if we bullied the author to give it to us. Regardless, this is our review.
Yes, they twisted my arm really hard.
The synopsis is as follows. A magical prison in the South Pole is attacked by the worst villains from myth and legend. They are then set free to wreak havoc upon the world. Ooh, ah. One makes his way to the North Pole and manages to murder the current Guardian of Light, or as us plebeians know the poor bugger, Santa Claus. Ooh, ah. I am paraphrasing quite horribly, so... With less than 2 months left before Christmas, the Guardians of the North Pole must find a new guardian to train to protect the light of the world. Shane Connor was just your average, everyday nice guy. He had his ups and downs in life, but he always did his best just to get by and live the best life he could. Then, on a very strange morning, various hours of his life go missing. The strange occurrences cause him his medium-wage job and his high-maintenance girlfriend. Shane realizes he needs a new job, but he never could imagine what happens next. Will Shane be able to rise up and wear the mantle of the Guardian of Light and save not only Christmas, but the world? This epic fantasy series re-sparks the inner child in any grown reader and reminds you of a time when you once believed in the most important thing in the world, to believe.
Ooh,
Yes, very exciting stuff.
Unfortunately, I didn't really enjoy this book.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you. There were various parts of the book that were handled well. For instance, like the author's macro view of the story was pretty solid. However, his prose is
His prose is weak. It's just
inexperienced is what I was going to say. Because
the end result is still the same, that the prose failed to deliver on the narrative, and so, along with some other choices, sometimes made it a little bit hard to get through. Not hard as in, oh my god, this is misery, but it just sapped enjoyment out of what, for me, was initially an interesting prospect. The reimagining of the Santa Claus and the Christmas and all those fables. And it's something that's been touched on before, but still.
And it is something that the author handles relatively well. For me at least, there were several points throughout the story where I was engaged in the lore and the myth of the world.
And there were some cool little bits of world building or imagination at work as well.
And the very first chapter was also, like, as first chapters go, the breaking in of a top secret prison to release all the horrors of nightmare and whatnot. That's a fairly strong first chapter.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pause it here. So I often hear that about the first chapter. You know, I have a review on Amazon where someone said they were buying the book for a friend and they read the first chapter and they had to buy the book for themselves. Well, I mean, that's just a given. You know, I've talked about my first chapter with other writers, and a lot of other writers have told me that I did a really bad thing because I didn't start with my main character in the first chapter. But most people seem to like that. Mainly because I wrote this as kind of like, you know, I've said before, when I wrote the book, I wrote it as if I was transcribing a movie I was watching, a movie in my head. I also want to point out here that based on what they're basically saying, from my understanding, you know, I guess they expected more and for more things to be explained or not explained. I'm not really sure. But when they talk about, you know, the little things and saying I have a big understanding of the overall story, well, when I wrote this story, I didn't write it to be a standalone book like most authors would tell you to do. I wrote this with a clear cut beginning, middle, and end in mind. The first two books are your beginning. The middle two books are your middle, and the last two books are your end. But let's continue on.
Just the prose throughout the story was inexperienced and just failed the story horribly.
Yeah. I was a little bit more on the fence for the world building as well. Because there are definitely some elements I liked about it, but there was also a lot of it that is just an exploration of the North Pole and the Santa Claus mythos that is what people are very familiar with. The fabricating of the toys, the elves, and that was more tedious to get through because I knew all of it, and the author doesn't really build upon the existing or change the existing mythos in a way that really forces the reader to reconsider what's going on.
Now, the reason I did that is because, yes, the Guardian of Light is Santa Claus. And as that, which is actually explained in the book, I had to leave in, Santa delivering the presents, the elves making the toys, the workshop in the North Pole, all of that. One thing, and they talk about this later. In fact, here, I think it's actually coming up.
Because one of the few he does multiple different species of elves, which is a merging of the Santa Claus elves and the more high fantasy elves, but that doesn't change the mechanics of the scenery per se. That doesn't change the mechanics of the Santa Claus mythos or how it interacts with the world. It's just a little bit of flavor text. And
now, I would beg to differ on that because, yes, there are the two different races of elves, but it's more than just flavor. Although they are, both elves, they have very different views. They have very different cultures almost. I mean, it's like, I'm from the USA. So, I mean, our culture here is vastly different than, let's say, the culture in China or Japan. We're all human, but our cultures are way different. What we believe is way different. Yes, they might share some similar beliefs and some similar, things amongst their race, but they are different. For example, the traditional elves from the Santa Claus mythos, hardly any of them would proclaim themselves to be good fighters. There might be a few, but you're not going to find them working security. Whereas as he put it, high fantasy style elves, they are more into the, making sure the North Pole is secure. They are the more capable fighters. Another thing they don't also bring up here is it's not just elves anymore. In this book series, I've actually got trolls, leprechauns, fairies, dwarves, all living together, working together at the North Pole. In various layers of the North Pole, which I felt, yes, I had to go through and explain, not just for Shane's benefit, but for the reader's benefit, to give you a glimpse that this place is its own self-contained world. But let's move on.
that made a lot of the world building for me a little bit more of, I want to get back to the story. I don't want to spend chapter after chapter exploring the North Pole.
Kind of briefly touching kind of on that. That's a theme that is recurrent throughout the story. Frequently, our main protagonist, Shane Connor, would encounter something new and exciting, and us as the readers, we clearly say, okay, that is clearly a result of magic. Shane, both the author and Shane, however, then take the time to ask what's going on here and receive the repetitive explanation of magic, which was largely unnecessary, and it kind of ties back into the re-exploring something that is very basically understood about this myth.
I think some of that is because the author felt he had to explore the North Pole because that's sort of
what people expect.
It was an instance where the names of it sparked initial interest, the North Pole, Santa Claus, map, and a lot of the main dropping, but it then necessitated the exploration thereof. You had to serve your subject material as a
Now, I want to say, like, they're talking about, as I said, I do have to explore the North Pole, but I honestly think I went into a little bit more detail than they're saying. Like, how does Santa Claus get around the world in one night? And the answer isn't just magic. The answer is, there's a magical machine which sends out a field around the world on Christmas Eve, which slows time down. It basically encapsulates the entire Earth in a giant time distortion bubble. Now, I may not have said it in that term. I went into more depth in the book, but I did try to explain without making it boring for the reader on what the magical explanation was. Not just, oh, it's magic. There is a, yes, magical reason for everything, but I did try to go into a little bit of more detail to make it believable to the readers. Especially since, as I've said, in the description, this is for more adult readers. And adults already do not believe in this world. So I'm trying to break that and bring you in to get you to believe, is this possibly true? But let's get back to what they're saying.
as opposed to exploiting it for maximum value.
So, the name dropping is actually when I was most engaged in the story. And it's not necessarily the fact that he dropped names. No, it's the book's rogues gallery I found was when I was most engaged. And you had this fairly long point of exposition wherein Shane was introduced to the history of the Santa Claus role and the Guardians of Light, and it was this long. It was not long because the book itself is not long. It's actually relatively well paced, and so. But anyway, you had this introduction to the villains and past Santa Clauses and how the mantle was progressed throughout the eras and generations, and usually this could be actually fall prey to extreme boredom because it's just a massive exposition. But I'm not entirely sure what it did well or how it differentiated itself. But I was engaged throughout all this because it was a history of how the Santa Clauses were one by one or successively knocked down by this series of villains, and all these villains through the course of the thing, they developed a degree of power and threat that was beneficial to the story, particularly when you started realizing that the villains are now loose on the world, and each one of them killed an experienced Guardian of Light. And now Shane, who is an inexperienced Guardian Light, has to deal with them all by himself.
Now, right there, I do want to point out that this is why what they'll call the classes, because that's what they were, that's why these classes were so important to the main character. That's why everybody at the North Pole was working hard to work with Shane to kind of bring him up to speed as quick as possible, to give him a crash course. In this book, the most important thing was just to get through Christmas. Just to make sure Shane knew enough to survive Christmas and to get through it as quick as possible. Because they had no idea when they were going to be attacked again. They're on high alert. They're trying to teach him all they can. And warning, spoiler. But this entire book actually becomes a huge plot point later on. There's something with from the time Shane says yes to becoming the Guardian to the end, well, till partly into 2, even though it mainly is focused on this here in book 1. Everything in here is relative to a huge plot point much later on. But let's get back to it.
I think one of the reasons it works for you is that you have a degree of connection to all the rogues. We understand who Mab is. We have partial understanding of Puck, of Krampus, and of Morgana, and etc. And so it's the names and the inherent story of them that carries that exposition narrative. The exposition narrative itself isn't immensely interesting because, again, it's a list of sequences and events, and since you have to go through a lot of names and events, they're fairly short. Otherwise, it would become too much. And it's actually a situation. Well, no, I can't even say that. I was going to say it would be a situation that optimally you'd want to space it out a little bit more so you could really build up the story of all the individual Santa Clauses and their histories. But A, the book's not long enough for that, and C, the story already is a little bogged down with the exploration of the world. There is very little actual narrative story that's explored. 70% of the book is
exposition and explaining that magic is what causes all these mystical events that Shane.
Now, I do want to point out they are right, to a certain degree. Like I said, how do I put this? When you hire somebody to do a job, sorry. When you hire someone to do a job, you have to teach them how your system works. You have to show them around so they know where everything is. You can't just drop them in and expect them to know what to do, how to run your system, how to go find something if they've never been in your place of business before, And that is generally what I tried. Took this and I treated it like the real world. Shane's never been to the North Pole. Yeah, there's all these stories out there. There's all this, what is fact, what is fiction? Questions that I tried to answer in this one. And I'll be honest, there's a little bit to it in book 2. Not as much, but there is a little bit more in book 2. But I kind of gloss over that and just stick to the story now. You do, like I said, get some, but not nearly as much as in book 1. And the reason is because book 1 is the origin story. Book 1 is Shane becoming the new Santa Claus and discovering what is fact and what is fiction. As for name dropping all the names, that too was done on purpose because I'm a huge fan of stories and, yeah, we'll just call it stories that incorporate things you already know. When The Matrix talked about deja vu, everyone's experienced deja vu. And that just helped create the question, is the Matrix real? And then the way they explain how the Matrix works helps to build on that. And there's lots of subtle things throughout the Matrix. You know, the series Once Upon a Time. I really liked that series. I think the last season was not the greatest, but I really do like that series. And it takes stories and it changes them in ways that, like, oh, this is something I know, but it's slightly different, you know? And I really enjoyed that. So, yes, I did use a lot of names, and I continue to use these names and even more names, which I think if they ever get to book 2, they'll be surprised because book 2 is really going to set the precedence of where this story is heading. Book 1 is the origin. Book 1 starts you on the journey. Book 2 is going to pace the journey, kind of. But let's get back to it.
Encounters. And that, for me, is probably one of the things, is probably something that bothered me a little more, or it doesn't bother me. It's something I find a little more depressing because when the story actually got down to narrative, it was actually when it was really pretty good. Because Shane wakes up on the dot, his buzzer rings, he gets up, he gets in the shower, and by the time he comes out of the shower, he is flabbergasted by the fact that he has lost 5 hours of his life.
3 hours.
Regardless. And this causes a cascade effect that we see the strings being pulled, but Shane himself has no idea what's going on because he is not part of the magical world. And so once again, that is a solid chapter, right? And then he starts looking for a job fairly quickly thereafter, which is, a relatively appealing character trait in a guy. And he's getting constantly tagged with phone messages and email telling him, hey, come look at this job. Woo, very exciting, great pay. But he ignores it because he thinks it's spam. And so what eventually happens is the world starts contorting around him so that he has no choice but to end up at this job interview.
That was one of my favorite parts about the book, where he was interacting with the magic. He didn't understand what was going on.
He wasn't even saying, hey, this is magic, this is weird. He's just like, am I going crazy? Which is an incredibly powerful and enjoyable narrative to be going on, particularly in the first few chapters.
And even though the reader knows what's going on, it's still appealing just because it's where the magic of the book is the most, not unique or original, but is the most non-fettered.
Because the author doesn't bother to explain or give signs, it's just happening, and he's allowing the reader to recognize that, oh, this is what's happening, and leaving it at that. So it's where the prose and was actually firing on all cylinders. Because there's like this one part where Shane literally gets out of his car, walks down a corner, turns and finds the exact same street again, but his car is not there. Right? So then he backtracks to the original street where he parked the car, and the car is still there. And so it's kind of creepy, and just, you see how the forces of light can change the world to fit their ends.
Then he gets to the North Pole, and you
get bogged down with explanation.
And then you go into the, where his training montage. Finger quotes montage. It's not really montage, but he gets set out a series of classes he has to attend, and the author walks you through all those classes. There's potion making, spell casting, history, and it becomes a school story for about a quarter of the book. But again, there's no stakes, there's no conflict. Lessons in and of themselves aren't unique, the author isn't introducing you to an entirely unique or original magic system.
And I did that for a reason, because, well, I mean, there is a sort of magic system, humans and other certain magical races like trolls, they can't really use a channeler, which is a wand or a staff. Um, Humans can't do magic without a channeler. Some of the other races, dwarves, would need a channeler, but like the elves don't. So there is like who can do it, who can't. I figured out. How it actually works is, is sort of dived into through the other books, but basically, everybody is drawing magic from the earth, and what you, as they'll point out here in a minute, what you will to happen, you have to be able to see it happening in your mind. You have to have enough desire, willpower, focus to pull the magic off. And that's because, I didn't want to get tied into loopholes with incantations, although I do explain incantations later down the road, I believe. Whereas, yes, there are ways to do magic with words, but
It is will this magic, the spell happens.
with a focus such as a wand or a staff.
And that results in these classes, besides moments here and there where, again, or a little bit of the visual panache or the imagination or the history comes in, the classes become a little bit tedious to get through.
and I understand that. I completely understand that, criticism, which is why I didn't want to do it very long. Basically, the classes they're talking about, I only dive into them like his first initial class each day, or I should say his first day of training. And then I kind of glaze over those and say that's what he does day after day. This is what he goes through. As they were saying, the montage, you know. Um, but I mainly focused on showcasing his first classes throughout each day or throughout the day. You know, oh, so he did this class on day one. This is what he did. This is what they told him. Class 2, Class 3, Class 4, Class 5, Class 6. And then, after the first day was over, I just basically said he kept going back, learning more and more and more. You know, he only has 2 months, less than 2 months, like a month and a half before Christmas. So,
And so, again, that's part of where I did not particularly enjoy this book comes in, is that so much of it was that tedious exploration and not enough story.
It's kind of funny because the authors, when the authors spend a great deal of time tediously exploring everything that we inherently knew about the story. The parts of it that we did not initially know or are new and strange and original, those are the ones where the author step back and let the story tell itself, and that's when the story was actually just really good, or not really good, but was at its best.
Yeah. I think that's more or less.
It's kind of beating a dead horse, but just because it's of particular interest to me, the book did not handle characters very well.
Oh, yeah, it had.
Not that they were bad or dislikable, they were just such tools for the narrative.
The character was not a focus point of the book. It was. The characters were there to conduct the readers through them. And maybe the author was doing the whole, you have to have a sort of superficial bland character so the reader can imagine themselves inside of it.
But that only works for the main character. You don't necessarily want your potion master to be a blank slate whose only lines or clinical descriptions of how to make potions. And that is a description for almost all the characters. It's clinical, straight to the point. no personality.
Clinical isn't the correct
Not
word.
exactly, but it's
There was not enough effort put into giving them distinctive, vibrant, or unique personalities. Again, like you said, they served the plot. And that was all the effort that was put into them. And occasionally a service code of something, but they were never given distinguishing traits, speech patterns.
And I want to stop him right there because actually, if you really do pay very close attention, I do try to give them distinct voices and personalities. Although I will say, yes, to a certain degree, they are correct. But that is because I tried to make it like real life. You know, this story only takes place from the end of October to the beginning of January. That's a little, slightly over 2 months. And how much are you going to learn about a person in 2 months when you've got thousands, hundreds of thousands of people you're coming into contact with? And each race does act differently. But at the North Pole, which I go a little bit into detail, not very much, so that's why I'm giving these guys credit for, not understanding the point I was trying to make with the exposition, but the entire North Pole works for the benefit of the North Pole and the Guardian. They are there to do their jobs. They go home, they wake up the next day ready to go back to work. Like the dwarves from Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. Yes, I mean, they have very outlandish, personalities. Some of which aren't even personalities, but medical conditions, like sleepy. Sorry, that's not a personality. That's called narcolepsy. But everybody at the North Pole works for the benefit of the North Pole. They're there to do a job. The teachers that were teaching Shane to be the Guardian, well, they were there to teach Shane. They weren't there to make friends with him. I mean, it's like when it's like a job or school, you know. When I was going to school, I didn't know half the kids in my class, especially when I went to a new school. And if nobody actually took the time to get to know me, you know, I didn't learn crap about them. I didn't know crap about my teachers' personal lives. I didn't know their hopes and dreams. I work with people that I've been at the same job for 8 years, and I still don't know the hopes and dreams of all my coworkers. So that is something I try to incorporate realism since it's only been 2 months. How much is Shane going to learn about these people that, yeah, he may interact with one character more than others, but even then, I mean, he's still kind of alone. They're there to teach him to be Santa Claus. That's it. They're not there making friends with him because they don't know if he's going to survive 1 year. So that was kind of my issue with this section. Yes, I did give them their own personalities. The personalities just didn't have a lot of time to shine because this is only 2 months. And if I'm going to progress the plot forward, that's what I had to do. But moving on to speech patterns, you know, every race at the North Pole, for example, one thing I pointed out to people, if you ever pay very close attention, all of them are speaking, well, what they basically say is, English, which is like common tongue. Um, they don't use contractions because in their languages and from their understanding, they don't know how to use contractions, especially the elves. The elves are the worst at this. They never use a contraction. So while Shane would say, I can't do that, they would say, I cannot do that. And that, to me, was giving the race a personality, saying, okay, trying to speak in common tongue, this is how it comes across. I did want to do more with the book, but I suck at languages. Sorry. Otherwise, I would have incorporated some original languages that I would have tried to make up, but I really am not good at that, which you'll probably see later. But
Desires or fears, nothing. Which is why they only exist to further the plot. And Shane himself is guilty of this to an extent. And you're in your head, so you can get a little bit more of the emotional level of it, but he did not have a concerted character that you could really point off and say, this is what the author was trying to do here. Shane is this, Shane is that.
Again, because as I said before, it's 2 months. I'm sorry, I don't start a job or go meet new people and say, hi, this is what I am. This is what I want out of life. These are my hopes and dreams, and these are my fears. I don't give away that information freely. Not many people do that in this world we live in today. I mean, we're living in an age where you're more guarded about who you are, you know. In fact, if somebody did walk up to you and said these things and made it clear, you'd probably think they were crazy. So, now, from Shane's point of view, in the story, we don't get much time with him beforehand. Because, to be fair, he's a young man. And young men at that time aren't always thinking about, what they want for their future. This is an issue I will talk about later I'm actually doing book 6 right now, and that is a topic that will be brought up between Shane and his love interest in book 6. They're going to be laying in bed and talking, and his love interest is going to say, hey, what did you want out of life before you became the guardian? And Shane's going to say, what it is or what it wasn't. And basically, as soon as he became the guardian, well, shoot, everything was thrown out the window because his entire world was just turned upside down. I mean, if you had dreams to be rich and, a multi-billion-dollar president of a high-tech company, and then you just learned that magic exists and now you have to become Santa Claus, I think that kind of ruins any plans you might have had. And you're going to be cracked wide open with a billion questions to do the job right.
He's, again, just the vessel.
Yeah. And despite all these, I actually kind of view the book as being a fairly decent child's book, kind of that young adult read. Simply because there are lots of parts of the book that I liked, as we've discussed. For me, the main drawback to the book is the author's inexperience.
Now, I'm not going to say I'm the greatest writer. I don't claim that. Yes, I am technically inexperienced. This was not the first book I wrote. The first few things I've written a few screenplays. I wrote a couple books before this, but I'd never published them. This was the first one I felt confident publishing because I had a 6-book series that I was so excited about, and I had worked out so many details. You know, also, if you look down here in the bottom section, the book they're talking about, the one that's over there. Okay, so you see my copy versus their copy. So that copy, the purple copy, that's the first edition. My copy is the second edition. And the first copy, I had a lot of issues, a lot of problems with. I don't know if that's the copy they read. I'd be more than happy if they bought a physical copy to send them a actual copy of the second edition for free, because I did have to go back and make a lot of changes, corrections, and that was my mistake. I also reworked the cover, and you'll notice the cover of this is actually white. And if you're looking down at the bottom of the screen, you'll see all my current covers for the series. And there's a little bit of a theme with this. There's a little bit of a theme with why the covers are the way they are. And that's because this one is supposed to be light. This one is supposed to be the most less serious, This is the light-hearted book. And the story is going to get progressively darker the more it goes on, which I try to showcase with these covers. But let's finish up here because we got like 2 minutes left.
Feels and experience from the prose to the choice of what to include and what to include.
Prose narrative structure.
And it's like book 2 and book 3, I feel are all actually going to improve dramatically.
I don't know. I can't say on that because it also just depends on how long it takes to read, or rather to write, and the span in between books.
Now, actually, when I released book 1, I keep pointing the wrong way. Their version, when I released book 1, it was actually already done. And so was book 2. And I was halfway through book 3. So all 5 books at the bottom here are actually already available on Amazon. And they don't have to buy them. If they want to email me, I'd be more than happy to send them PDFs.
I would have given the book about 2 stars, 2.5 if I was feeling generous. I just didn't like it.
Yeah, I'd probably have to give it like 2.5. I feel like the book has potential, and it has potential because the author has had the grasp of macro, right?
Again, the book had potential, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah. It is so horribly torpedoed by just the inexperience of the prose. That's our terribly depressing and lambasting review.
Now, as for the score, 2.5 stars, to me, I mean, I'm guessing they're going by most Amazon standards, Goodreads standards, a 5-star system, in which case 2.5 is about average. And as I've pointed out many times during this video, this is only the beginning part. That score might go up after they read parts 2 and 3, because after you read more of the story, you'll come to an understanding of where the story is going. And you'll see that, books 1 and 2 are the beginning. You can't just watch the first 15 minutes of a movie a really good movie and say, well, this movie sucks. I'm not going to watch the rest. Because if you did that, then you might miss what, comes after, which could be great. Especially if that first 15 minutes had a great solid 5-minute opening. And they said it themselves that my first 5 chapters were pretty solid. They really liked it until Shane gets to the North Pole. Which, also, it kind of strikes me weird, and I've had this talk with a few of my readers, but there's surprisingly a huge, huge mystery in this book that nobody's asked the question to. I don't want to say it because I don't want to point it out. But I make something very crystal clear in this book, and it doesn't seem like anybody's really picked up on it. So I find that very interesting. Maybe I didn't make it clear enough.
Yeah. Oh well.
Oh well.
We hope you all have wonderful lives and much happiness.
All right, so I think that's
We
about
don't
the end of their
need,
review.
Governmental contracts to take us out or anything, No hiring killers on us. That we have enough of those after
It's
already.
illegal.
Yes, and it's
So that's the end of their review. So, yeah, like I said, I'm really thankful to these gentlemen for doing this review and saying what they said. It's completely honest. Great feedback. I would love to see what they think of, like I said, the rest of the series. If they're at least willing to try. I've always said book 1 is actually, surprisingly, not my favorite. that might be terrible for me to say as an author. Don't get me wrong, I love all my books. They're great and wonderful, and I love them. I've just always, to me, if I was going to rank my book series, it would probably be book 3, book 6, very closely followed by book 5, then book 2, no, I don't know, 2 and 4, I'd probably put 4 up, then 2, then 1. That's why 3 is way at the top for me. So, and it's book 2, like I said, book 2 and 4, they can swap, it just depends how I feel at the time. But yeah, this has been my response to my very first book review. And I want to, again, one more time, thank you so much. It means the world that you guys took a chance, read my book, and made a video. I want to thank you all for watching. If you have not yet, please subscribe to this channel. Make sure to click the notification bell. And I will talk to you all next time.